Have you ever just looked at everything going on in the global financial system and gotten that feeling in your gut that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong? You know, that sense that the stability we're all told to count on is really just resting on a foundation that's getting more and more fragile by the day? Well, it's a common feeling. But what if it's more than just a gut feeling? What if all the chaos, the inflation that eats away at your savings, the mountains of debt that just keep growing, what if these aren't just random, unfortunate events? What if they are actually predictable stages in a cycle that has repeated itself over and over again for centuries? A cycle that, if you look at the historical record, seems to have a mathematical endpoint. Today, we are not going to be dealing in wild predictions or conspiracy theories. No. We are going to examine a blueprint, a pattern of monetary collapse that has played out time and time again. And we're going to ask the most critical question of all. Is our current system following that exact same well-trodden path to ruin? Welcome to the Bullion Signal Podcast. This is the channel where we look right past the day-to-day noise of the markets to really understand the powerful long-term macroeconomic forces that are shaping your wealth and, frankly, your future. We focus on hard assets, real assets, like gold and silver, not as some kind of speculative bet, but as proven tools for preserving your purchasing power in what's becoming an incredibly unstable world. Now, if that sounds like a conversation you need to be a part of, do yourself a favor and subscribe to the channel and make sure you hit that notification bell. That way, you won't miss any of our future analysis. The question you see on your screen right now, that's the entire focus of today's episode. Are these huge financial crises just random bolts from the blue? Or are they the inevitable mechanical outcome of a system's design? The source material we're breaking down today makes a powerful argument for the latter. It suggests that what we are all living through right now, it's not new. It's more like a rerun of an old movie, and if you know where to look, you already know how it ends. So the framework for our whole discussion today is what the source material calls the monetary collapse machine. Now I know, it sounds dramatic, right? But try to think of it less as some sinister invention and more like a law of physics for finance. It basically describes the life cycle of any monetary system that's built on debt, which is exactly the kind of system the entire world is operating under today. The argument is that once a nation decides to build its currency on ever-expanding credit instead of a hard, tangible asset, it sets this four-stage machine in motion. And it's not driven by some grand conspiracy. It's a process driven by very human things: political promises, human greed, and at the end of the day, simple, unavoidable mathematics. And according to this model, this machine only has one possible destination. So let's take a look at the four stages of this machine, the four gears that make it turn. Stage one is the anchor. This is where a new currency system is born. To create trust and confidence, it's anchored or tied to a real, tangible asset that has intrinsic value. And throughout history, that's almost always been gold. This is crucial because it limits the ability of politicians to just create money out of thin air. But that discipline is also a constraint, and eventually the desire for more spending, whether it's for wars, social programs, you name it, it just becomes overwhelming. This leads directly to stage two, debasement. The link, the anchor to that hard asset, is either weakened or in most cases completely severed. The printing presses are fired up, and at first this feels amazing. It seems like an economic miracle, a free lunch. But printing money doesn't create wealth, does it? No, it only dilutes the value of all the money that already exists. And that, in turn, leads to stage three, instability. This is where the consequences of all that printing really start to bite. You see it as rising inflation, crazy asset bubbles, and growing social unrest. The system becomes volatile, unpredictable, and finally, all of this culminates in stage four, the reset. The currency simply loses the confidence of the people, its value collapses, and the system either hyperinflates into complete worthlessness or it's officially devalued and replaced with a new one, which ironically is often re-anchored to a hard asset. And just like that, the machine has completed one full cycle. Okay, so that's the theory. It's a neat four-step pattern, but let's see how this machine actually works in the real world. Our first case study is the British Empire and the pound sterling. For over a century, the pound was the undisputed king of currencies, the world's reserve currency. If there was ever a currency that seemed permanent, unshakable, it was the pound. It was literally the bedrock of global trade.
But as we are about to see, it was not immune to the laws of this machine. Its story is an incredibly powerful warning about how even the mightiest empires can watch their financial power just evaporate once they abandon fiscal discipline.
The machine was officially set in motion back in 1914. To fund the absolutely immense cost of World War I, Britain did what nearly every warring nation in history does. They suspended the gold standard. They broke the anchor. That was the start of the debasement stage. After the war in 1925, they tried to restore confidence by going back on the gold standard, but they made a fatal error, an error driven by national pride. They repegged the pound at its old pre-war value. Now, here's the problem with that. They had printed vast sums of money during the war, which had severely debased the currency. So this new exchange rate was completely artificial. It was way too high. And the result was that it made British exports incredibly expensive and it absolutely crippled their economy. The system was under immense strain. By 1931, the pressure was just too much. Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard for good. Stage 2 was now complete. The debasement was permanent.
And what happened the moment they cut that final link to gold? Well, this number, it tells the whole story. The pound sterling was immediately, almost instantly, devalued by nearly 30% on the international markets. Just stop and think about what that really means. Imagine you were a British citizen. You spent your entire life working hard, saving in the world's most trusted currency. And then you wake up one morning and almost a third of your wealth is just gone, wiped out overnight. Your life savings, your retirement, all the purchasing power you were counting on for your future, gutted. This was the reset, stage 4. It was an absolutely brutal lesson for an entire generation about the critical difference between currency, which is just a government's promise, and real money. The machine had run its course for the British Empire, and in doing so, it paved the way for a new global power to rise.
So as the British Empire faded, the United States rose to take its place, and the US dollar took the crown from the pound as the world's new reserve currency. Now, you would think that American policymakers would have studied the British experience very carefully and learned a valuable lesson. But the source material we're looking at argues that they did not. Instead, they simply reset the machine and started the exact same 4-stage cycle all over again. The principles of this machine, it seems, are a lot more powerful than the lessons of history. So, in 1944, with much of the world in ruins, the Bretton Woods Agreement established a new global financial system. This was the new anchor, stage 1. The US dollar was officially pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and every other major currency was then pegged to the dollar. America basically promised the world that its dollars were as good as gold, and for a while it worked. But then came the 1960s. The U.S. found itself fighting a very expensive war in Vietnam, while at the same time building out massive social programs back home, the so-called guns and butter policy. The temptation to pay for it all by just creating new money was simply too great. The printing presses ran hot, and pretty soon there were far more US dollars circulating around the world than the US had gold in its vaults at Fort Knox to back them up. Other countries, especially France, they noticed this. They did the math, and they started showing up and demanding physical gold for their paper dollars, as was their right under the agreement. This led directly to the breaking point. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon went on television and announced he was temporarily closing the gold window. Well, that temporary suspension is now over 50 years old. The anchor was broken. Stage 2, debasement, had officially begun for the US dollar. Now, unlike the British pound's reset, which was a sudden, violent shock, the US dollar's reset has been a slow, grinding process, a long, painful bleed out. Just look at this slide. A dollar from 1971 has the same purchasing power as about 13 cents today. That is a staggering loss of 87% of its value. This is the debasement stage playing out over decades. It's not a dramatic overnight collapse. It's a quiet theft, a silent robbery of your savings year after year. It's the reason you feel like you're working harder and harder but just falling further behind. It's why prices for housing, for education,
for healthcare seem to spiral ever upwards into the stratosphere. The value isn't really in those things going up. The real story is the value of the dollar in your pocket going down. Now, this long debasement phase nearly came to a catastrophic end during the 2008 financial crisis. The whole system, which was built on a mountain of bad debt, it completely seized up. It was a moment of truth, a real chance to address the fundamental flaws. Instead, as this quote from the source material just perfectly states, the authorities chose to solve the problem by making it exponentially bigger. They responded to a crisis that was caused by way too much debt by creating the largest expansion of debt in all of human history. They introduced brand new policies like quantitative easing, or QE, which is really just a clinical, fancy-sounding term for massive electronic money printing. They didn't fix the machine, they just poured gasoline on the fire to keep it running a little longer. And that brings us right up to the present moment. So we've seen the four-stage pattern play out with the British pound. We've seen the US dollar follow the first two stages, anchor and debasement, and then put that debasement on steroids after 2008. So the critical question now is, where are we today? Well, according to the framework we've been using, all the signs are pointing to us being deep inside stage 3, instability, and the conditions are rapidly ripening for the final stage, the reset. The scale of the problem we're facing today is, well, it's difficult for the human mind to truly comprehend. The U.S. federal debt is now over $36 trillion, and what's even crazier is that it's now increasing by $1 trillion roughly every 100 days. This number is no longer just some abstract figure on a government website. It is the defining feature of our financial system. It represents promises that have been made that cannot, mathematically, be kept in dollars of stable value. This mountain of debt is the direct legacy of 50 years of debasement. It is the fuel for the instability we are all beginning to witness. But here's the thing. It's not even the total amount of debt that's the most immediate problem. It's this number right here that the source identifies as the fuse on the bomb. Nearly $9 trillion of U.S. debt is scheduled to mature and must be refinanced by the year 2026. Now, this debt was originally issued back when interest rates were at or near 0%. Now it has to be rolled over at the current much higher interest rates of 4, 5, or even 6%. The consequence of this is that the interest payments on the national debt are absolutely exploding. They are on track to become one of the largest single items in the entire federal budget, surpassing even defense spending. It's a vicious mathematical feedback loop. Higher debt leads to higher interest payments, which requires issuing even more debt to pay for it all. This is the very definition of an unsustainable path. This brutal mathematical reality forces the authorities into what the source calls an impossible choice. There are only two ways out. Option 1 is to default on the debt. This would mean an open admission that the U.S. government cannot pay its bills. It would trigger an instantaneous collapse of the U.S. Treasury market, which is the very foundation of the entire global financial system. It is, for all intents and purposes, unthinkable. So that leaves them with option 2, devalue. You see, the government can never technically run out of the dollars it creates. So the Federal Reserve can, and most certainly will, create new money out of thin air to pay the interest and to fund the government's massive deficits. But this is not a free lunch. Every single new dollar created devalues all the existing dollars held by citizens, by savers, by investors around the entire world. So faced with these two choices, an immediate politically suicidal default or a slow, insidious devaluation through inflation, which one do you think a government will always pick? They will always, always choose to devalue the currency. They will choose inflation. So, after walking through this entire historical pattern and applying it to our current situation, what's the big takeaway? What are the practical lessons you can actually draw from this analysis to protect yourself and your family? Because this isn't just some academic exercise. Understanding this pattern has profound implications for how you should be thinking about saving, about investing, and about preserving your wealth in the years ahead.
All right, let's summarize the key arguments here. First, and most importantly, these debt-based systems are not permanent. They don't last forever. They have a mathematical expiration date.
Second, the belief that this time is different is probably the most dangerous illusion in all of finance. It has been wrong every single time this cycle has played out through history. Third, this pattern systematically destroys the value of currency-based assets. Now, what does that mean? It means the cash in your savings account, government bonds, annuities, any instrument that is just a claim on a currency that is being intentionally devalued. And finally, the pattern consistently rewards holding real assets, things that governments and central banks cannot create with a keystroke. We're talking about assets with real intrinsic value, like physical gold and silver, productive land, things you can actually touch.
And you know, this might be the most important message of all. The real power of this framework isn't in trying to predict the exact day or week that a reset is going to happen. No one can do that. Its real value is that it gives you a clear lens through which to view the present. When you understand this machine, the daily headlines about inflation, about government spending, about market volatility, they stop being just confusing noise. Instead, you can recognize them for what they are. The predictable symptoms of a system that is deep in stage 3, moving inexorably towards stage 4. It allows you to make calm, rational decisions based on a historical pattern, rather than reacting emotionally to the chaos.
So we'll leave you with the question you see on the screen. If history teaches us again and again that all fiat currencies, that is, currencies backed by nothing but government promise, eventually follow this cycle of birth, debasement, and death, it forces us to ask a much more fundamental question. What provides lasting value? What has survived every single one of these resets throughout all of human history? What can you own that sits outside of this failing system and cannot be devalued by the stroke of a politician's pen? The answer to that question is, I truly believe, the key to navigating the turbulent times that lie ahead. Thank you for joining us here on the Bullion Signal podcast. If you found this analysis valuable, please help us spread the word by hitting that like button, sharing this episode with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. Now, please remember, the information presented here is for educational purposes only and is not financial advice. You should always do your own research and consult with a professional before making any investment decisions. Stay safe and stay informed.